Under a sky streaked with early autumn light, the forests near Montana's Beartooth Mountains stirred with quiet life. Elk bugled in the distance. A hawk circled high over amber treetops. And somewhere, padding silently between pines and gravel roads, a tiny grizzly bear cub walked alone. Not lost, not panicked, but deliberate, focused, down below in a sleepy mountain town nestled along the edge of the wilderness. Deputy Caroline Walker was finishing her morning patrol, a routine loop through forest roads she could drive with her eyes closed. But that day, something broke the pattern. A call came through, "Ma'am. There's a bear cub, and it won't stop following cars. It should have been simple shoo the animal away alert." Fish and Wildlife logged the incident. But when Caroline arrived, she didn't find a confused animal. She found something else, something waiting. It wasn't just the way the cub looked at her. It was the way it stayed, the way it refused to leave. And then, the moment she realized why Caroline would later say it felt like the forest itself had stopped breathing. What could possibly make a wild grizzly bear cub follow a human? What was it trying to say? And who or what was it leading her toward? Today's story is about instinct, about courage, and about the bond between two lives that never should have crossed, but did. Let's begin. The morning started quiet. Pine needles shimmered under golden light, and the mountain air still carried that crispness that only comes after a long frost. Caroline Walker, sheriff's deputy for Stillwater County, had driven this stretch of forest road near the Beartooth Pass for nearly 2 decades. She knew its curves and hollows better than the back of her hand. Most mornings were predictable deer near mile marker 6, a stalled RV or two, the occasional overzealous camper who didn't quite understand bear country etiquette. But that morning, something was off. Her radio crackled to life just past 7:10 a.m. "Unit 4, we've got reports of a bear cub near Forest Service Road 112. Won't leave the road. Multiple calls, not aggressive, but not moving either. Caroline pressed her thumb to the mic. 10-4. I'm just a few miles out. On my way. She expected what any seasoned wildlife officer might, a frightened cub, maybe recently separated from its mother. Or worse, one that had lost her. But what she didn't expect, what no one really would, was how this cub looked at her. When she arrived, 3 cars were parked haphazardly along the roadside, drivers standing outside, hands shielding their eyes, talking in hushed tones. A woman holding a steaming travel mug whispered, "It won't budge, just sits there in the middle of the road." Then it started walking behind the last truck, like it was following it. Caroline stepped out of her cruiser. No need for sirens, no need for alarm. The forest was quiet except for the soft click of a raven in the trees. And there he was, small, shaggy, and dusted with morning dew. The cub was maybe 6 months old, just past the age when grizzlies begin to shadow their mothers, closely learning which berries are safe and which trails to avoid. He was skinny, ribs barely showing under a thick cinnamon coat. He didn't growl, didn't back away, didn't act startled by the line of humans watching him from a distance. He didn't seem afraid of Caroline at all. That was the first red flag. She moved slowly, hands visible, no sudden movements. The cub sat down on the gravel and stared. Not a random glance the kind animals give when sizing up a threat, but a long, almost unsettling gaze. And then he stood and started walking, not into the woods, not away, but straight toward her. She took a step back. He stopped. Then again, 1 paw. Forward. Then 2. Every time she backed up, he followed. "Are you hurt?" Caroline whispered half to herself. Her training told her to keep her distance. Grizzly cubs can be unpredictable even at this age. And somewhere in the back of her mind, the possibility lingered the mother could be nearby. Watching. Waiting. But the bear didn't act like he was expecting protection. He acted like he needed help. Caroline did what she was trained to do. She radioed the Forest Service, requested a wildlife biologist for evaluation, and asked the drivers to stay in their cars until further notice. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. Grizzly bear cubs, especially ones raised in the wild, avoid humans. It's instinctive. Even orphaned cubs taught to survive in sanctuaries are conditioned to stay away from roads, scents, and sounds of human activity. That's what makes them releasable. That's what keeps them alive. But this one, he lingered, sat in the middle of the road, walked behind her cruiser when she tried to leave, pawed at her rear bumper, like he wanted her to see something or follow. There's a famous story from Denali National Park back in the early 2000s where a wolf kept showing up at the same bend of a hiking trail. Rangers thought it was strange, but they didn't investigate. A week later, they found the body of a missing hiker just 100 yards into the trees near where the wolf had last been spotted. Since then, experienced rangers say, if an animal breaks its own rules, pay attention. That story played in Caroline's mind as she watched the cub pace the road's shoulder, pausing occasionally to look straight at her before turning back, walking a few feet and looking again. She'd seen dogs do that, not bears. She crouched beside her cruiser, watching him from a safe distance, scribbling notes into her logbook. Unusual eye contact. Following behavior. No signs of injury. Hesitates near the tree line. Refuses to retreat. And something else, he kept lifting his right paw as he walked. Like it hurt. But when she zoomed in with her field binoculars, she saw a flash of dark green plastic. A strap of some kind. A mount. That wasn't part of his body. And it wasn't wild. By the time the biologist arrived, Dr. Elias Bennett, gruff and sun-worn but sharp as ever, the cub had wandered just off the road, sitting beneath a leaning pine. Elias peered through his scope and grunted. Well, I'll be. That's a locator tag. Not one of ours, though. Wrong size, wrong color. Too small for GPS tracking. Caroline folded her arms. You think this was homemade, maybe, or repurposed? Let me run the numbers. He took out his satellite tablet and began typing. The cub stood up again, walked toward them, then stopped. Sat. Dr. Bennett looked up from his screen. That tag. It's registered to a personal emergency beacon. Belongs to someone named Jasper Lane. He filed a backcountry entry log 3 days ago. No return log since. Caroline's heart clenched. So he's still out there. Looks that way. Was he solo? Yeah, photographer, wildlife restoration work. And then, without hesitation, the cub turned toward the woods, walked 10 feet, stopped, looked back. A pattern was forming. This is absurd, Elias muttered. Grizzlies don't lead humans. Caroline stared after the cub. He hadn't disappeared. He was waiting. Maybe this one does, she said quietly. That's when Elias hesitated. Really hesitated. He rubbed the back of his neck, something Caroline hadn't seen him do in 20 years of working these forests. If we follow, we're banking everything on a cub. I've seen search dogs miss more than this bear's shown us. Elias sighed. I don't like how this adds up. But Caroline was already checking her first aid kit, tying her boots tight. I don't like the idea of someone out there dying with a cub as their only chance. The cub moved again. Farther this time. Caroline followed. As they stepped into the trees, pine shadows shifted across the road, erasing the last bits of morning light. The cars were gone now. The road behind them was silent. And ahead the cub disappeared into the wilderness. But not too far. Never too far. Because something was waiting. And someone needed saving. Dr. Elias Bennett had spent most of his adult life trying not to attach human meaning to animal behavior. He'd seen well-meaning people get it wrong. A bear standing on its hind legs wasn't waving, it was sniffing. A bobcat pressing its head to a human's palm wasn't showing affection. It was tolerating a gesture it had learned would earn food. And don't even get him started on YouTube videos that added cute music over dangerous encounters. Anthropomorphism, as he'd told every intern he ever trained, was a slippery slope. But now, here he was, knee-deep in pine needles, staring at a bear cub that wouldn't stop waiting for them to catch up. The walk had started slowly. The cub, still limping slightly, would trot ahead a dozen paces. Stop. Turn back to make eye contact, then move again. Always within view, always pausing long enough to make sure Caroline and Elias were following. Not a sound. No growls. No fear. Just this quiet, determined urgency. It made no sense. Caroline, Elias said under his breath, "You know this isn't typical." "I know," she replied. "I'm just not ready to call it a coincidence." The deeper they went into the forest, the stronger that feeling grew. Birds flitted overhead, a squirrel barked, but the cub stayed silent, focused. Every move told them, "This way, keep going." Elias tried to remind himself of the facts. Grizzly bear cubs, especially those orphaned or released from wildlife rehab, don't exhibit this kind of behavior. Most avoid roads, avoid humans. Even partially habituated cubs tend to revert to caution once reintroduced. This one, not only did it stay near the highway, but it also chose to approach people. That was red flag number 1. Red flag number 2 was the tracker. Earlier that morning, when he zoomed in with his scope and read the small number etched into the casing JL4197, he knew immediately it wasn't government issued. The color was off, and it didn't follow any state or federal tagging system. So he ran it through the emergency locator network. Sure enough, Jasper Lane registered 3 days ago at one of the dispersed campsites near Crystal Ridge. A solo wildlife photographer, age 39, experienced in the backcountry and missing. No checkout scan, no messages, and now his locator was strapped to a bear cub's paw. "This is more than just strange," Elias muttered as he ducked under a low branch. "Could he have tried to send the cub for help?" Caroline asked. "Grizzlies don't retrieve," Elias said. "They're not dogs. They don't think like that." And yet, Elias didn't finish the sentence. He thought back to a case 15 years ago out near Glacier, where a young mountain lion had returned repeatedly to the edge of a campground after its sibling died nearby. Some believed it was mourning. Others said it was a coincidence. Elias never took a side. But this was different. This wasn't just a cub lingering. It was guiding, and it kept guiding them forward. At one point, the cub veered off the trail and into a small clearing. There, nestled in a bed of pine duff, was something half buried, a torn corner of a rainproof sleeping bag, a cracked plastic lens filter, and a half-eaten protein bar still in its wrapper. Caroline knelt beside the items. "You think he left these here? I think he camped here," Elias said, "which means we're close." The cub didn't wait. He was already walking again. They moved quickly now past a fallen cedar through a gulch thick with ferns until the terrain began to change. The incline steepened. Loose rock appeared underfoot. And then just beyond the next ridge, they saw it a deep ravine, maybe 25 feet down, with jagged edges and an old game trail leading into it. The cub paced at the top, making small harp sounds. Not cries, not growls. Something in between. Elias peered over the edge. He saw a boot, then a leg. Then the full body of a man half covered in a blanket, one arm twisted awkwardly under a fallen branch. Jasper Lane. Elias's heart dropped. "We found him." Carolyn immediately radioed for emergency extraction. Jasper was breathing barely but unresponsive. Dehydrated, pale, likely injured during a fall, but he was alive. And the only reason they found him was that the bear had led them here. Elias sat back on his heels as medics arrived. He watched the cub, the small cinnamon-colored grizzly, who now sat quietly on the edge of the ravine, watching everything unfold. He didn't flee, didn't charge, didn't panic. He waited. And when Jasper opened his eyes an hour later, the first word he whispered wasn't water or help or even thank you. It was a name. Coda. Caroline's eyebrows lifted. He has a name. Elias stood still, because now all of it made sense. Later, after Jasper was stabilized and airlifted out, Elias sat beside Caroline in the back of the search van, scrolling through archived emails from the Wildlife Outreach Alliance. He remembered Jasper's name now, not just as a photographer, but as a registered volunteer in the Grizzly cub fostering program based out of Bozeman. 2 years ago, Jasper had applied to foster an orphaned cub named Coda after its mother had been killed in a vehicle collision just outside Yellowstone. He'd raised the cub until it was strong enough to be considered for rewilding, and this was that cub. Elias felt something heavy shift in his chest, a belief he hadn't questioned in decades. "We trained him to forget humans," he said aloud, "to run from roads, to stay wild, but he didn't forget Jasper," Caroline said quietly. Elias shook his head. "No, he didn't. There's a small truth buried in this moment, a lesson that doesn't come from books or training manuals. Sometimes when we try to erase all signs of human connection in the name of rewilding, we forget that bonds don't disappear just because we want them to." Coda remembered. And when it mattered most, he returned. Real-life rehab programs have shown how fragile the process is. A cub that grows too attached to humans can never be released. But if the bond is built on trust and distance, on instincts rather than reward, sometimes it sticks in ways we don't yet understand. That's what Coda did. He wasn't tame, he wasn't trained, but he chose to help. And in doing so, he forced Elias to rethink everything he thought he knew about where the wild ends and the human begins. As the rescue crew packed up, Caroline looked back at the trees. Coda was gone. No trace, no paw prints, just pine shadows and the hum of wind through firs. But the questions he left behind stayed long after. Could a bear remember that deeply? And if so, what else might they understand? Caroline had always trusted her instincts. They'd kept her alive during flash flood snowstorms and once years ago when a black bear mother charged through a campsite in the dead of night. But now, those same instincts were at war, because everything she knew about wild animals told her this wasn't right, and everything she felt told her to keep going. Coda had vanished the moment the rescue team airlifted Jasper out. 1 minute he was there watching silent still, and the next just the sound of birds and wind. It had been almost 24 hours since then, and neither she nor Dr. Bennett could stop thinking about the cub's behavior. Elias called it unrepeatable, a 1 in a million anomaly. But Caroline wasn't so sure. She'd seen something else in those golden eyes. Intention. Not random movement, not confused, circling. Purpose. So when they found the second clue less than half a mile from the ravine, everything shifted. It was early morning. The search team had already cleared the perimeter. Coda was presumed gone back into the wilderness, but Caroline wasn't convinced. She followed her gut and retraced their path from the ravine's edge, circling wider than protocol suggested. That's when she saw it. Fresh tracks. Small, lightly pressed into the frost-covered dirt. The same uneven stride from yesterday, the limp was still there. But this time the trail didn't lead away from the site. It circled back, and it stopped at a cluster of white pines near a fallen log. Resting there, half hidden under leaves, was a folded strip of canvas. Caroline brushed it off, unfolded it. It was a torn section of a camera bag. Inside, a spare battery pack, water filter, and laminated wildlife tags bearing Jasper Lane's name. She radioed Elias. He arrived 15 minutes later, silent as ever, crouching low to inspect the find. "Where'd you say you found this?" Caroline pointed. "It's fresh. No mold, no animal bites. He must have dropped it yesterday or early this morning." Elias examined the ground. He came back. Coda circled back here after the rescue. "Why?" Elias hesitated. Cubs don't backtrack without reason. If he's still near the site, he may not believe the rescue is complete. You think he's still looking for Jasper or protecting something else? Caroline's gaze drifted to the trees. "Then we're not done." They packed light and set off again. No official call-out this time, no full search crew. Just the two of them, a basic trauma kit. Extra rations and a quiet question neither of them said aloud. What if Coda had returned? For a reason we hadn't yet seen. They moved with care. The forest grew denser past the ridge. Underbrush thickened. The air turned damp and heavy, shaded by lodgepole and cedar. No trail, no signs, just memory and instinct guiding their feet. About a mile in, they found more tracks. This time they were clearer, deliberate. Not zigzagging like a panicked animal, but following the natural contours of the terrain. A wildlife trail, maybe, but with a strange rhythm. Not just movement. Pausing, circling, almost like scouting. At a bend near a stream, Elias stopped abruptly. Look, on the bank, more gear. A shattered thermos, a lens cap. A wool glove was soaked from the stream. And just upstream, wedged between two moss-covered rocks, was the corner of a dry bag. Inside it, a small spiral notebook and a weathered map marked in Jasper's handwriting. Next to it, paw prints. Not just Coda's. Another bear, fresh, Elias said. Could be a juvenile grizzly, too big for Coda. Caroline's hand moved instinctively toward her sidearm, but Elias raised a calming hand. No prints passed here. They left. They scanned the map. The markings led to one final X, about another 2 miles northwest. A spot labeled simply C2 fallback. Carolyn exhaled. If Jasper had backup gear there, he could have stashed food or shelter. If Coda returned, maybe he was drawn to scent. They followed the trail slowly. The forest changed again, shifting to higher elevation, thinner air. Frost lined the edges of fallen logs. The sun broke through, occasionally glinting off patches of ice. An hour later, they arrived. The spot wasn't much, just a clearing surrounded by rock outcrops. But in the center, covered with brush, was an old emergency tent frame. Collapsed, ripped along the side, empty inside except for what was left of a makeshift cot and blood. Dried, not fresh. And another tracker, same make as the one on Coda. Caroline bent down. He had more than one beacon. Elias nodded, likely for insurance, in case one failed. But why would this one be left behind? She looked up. Unless he gave the other one to Coda, on purpose. That idea hung in the air like a gust of cold wind. Giving a grizzly bear cub a locator beacon wasn't just unconventional, it was unheard of. There are no field manuals for it, no training programs. You can't train a grizzly to deliver help like a search dog. And yet, Coda had done exactly that. It challenged everything Elias had taught for 30 years. He sat down heavily on a rock, silent. Caroline handed him the notebook. You should see this. He flipped through. Field notes, observations, but one page stood out. Jasper had written Coda responds to trail markers, recognizes road scent, trained to avoid highways, but still seeks human scent when distressed. If I don't make it, he might. Elias exhaled slowly. So this was intentional. A test. A last resort. It wasn't training in the traditional sense. It was an association. Coda hadn't been taught to help, but he'd learned that roads meant humans and humans meant safety. If Jasper couldn't help himself, Coda might do it for him. Caroline sat beside him quietly, watching the wind ripple through the trees. They were far from the road now. The forest around them was thick and unforgiving. It wouldn't have taken much a misstep, a bad storm, for Jasper to become just another name on a list of backcountry losses. And if Coda hadn't found them, no one would have. Something is humbling in that, in knowing that sometimes help doesn't come from where you expect. That maybe the line between wild and human compassion isn't as sharp as we draw it. That thought stayed with Caroline as they retraced their steps. By late afternoon, the trail began to blur again. Shadows lengthened, no more new signs, but neither of them spoke about turning back. Because somewhere not far, Coda was still out there, watching, waiting. And he might not be done showing them what he knew. The ravine wasn't visible until they were almost on top of it. One more bend, a break in the undergrowth, and then a sudden drop 25 feet down into a narrow gash in the earth where water once flowed. Moss-covered rocks lined the walls, At the bottom, a muddy stream trickled past the roots of an old, half-fallen pine. And just beyond it, wedged awkwardly beneath the angled tree, was a human body. Jasper Lane. Caroline saw the shape first. Dark clothing, torn sleeve, motionless arm. Then the contrast of pale skin against the soil. She didn't shout, didn't panic. She just dropped to one knee, pulled her radio, and gave the clearest transmission she could. Confirmed visual. Adult male. Stillwater coordinates 47.3 north, 109.9 west. Suspected compound leg injury. Air evac required. Elias moved to the edge beside her. He was quiet, scanning, calculating descent angles, assessing risk. Then a rustle behind them. They turned. Coda had returned. He was smaller than she remembered, or maybe the distance made him feel more fragile. The cub stayed at the edge of the clearing, making low, stuttered sounds, not quite growls, not quite cries. His ears flicked back. His eyes never left the ravine. "He brought us here," Caroline said. Elias didn't argue. He didn't offer a theory or lecture or a warning. He just nodded slowly and reached for his climbing rope. They didn't wait. The sun was dropping. And if Jasper was going to survive another night in this cold, he'd need medical help now, not in the morning. The descent wasn't difficult, but it was careful. Caroline went first, easing herself down the rock face, testing every foothold. At the base, she stepped through knee-high brush and called softly, "Jasper, it's Caroline Walker. You're safe." No answer. She crouched beside him. His face was scratched, his lips cracked and one eye swollen shut. His breathing was shallow but steady. He'd created a small cover from his jacket using branches to block the wind. His leg was pinned under the base of the fallen pine, bone broken, twisted unnaturally. Elias dropped in next landing with a grunt. He opened the emergency kit and began assessing the injury. Right tibia, fractured badly, possible compression damage, might be a concussion too. Jasper stirred faintly, then he spoke, barely above a whisper, "Coda." Elias and Caroline froze. He said it again, "Coda. He found you." Caroline leaned closer. "He did. He led us here." Tears filled Jasper's eyes. His voice cracked. "I thought maybe he would. I told him, road means help, people." He remembered. Caroline looked up toward the rim of the ravine. The cub was still there, watching, listening, and maybe understanding. It was a truth too strange to explain. A grizzly bear cub, trained through instinct and association, had retrieved help not once but twice. The kind of behavior is usually reserved for rescue dogs or dolphins in marine therapy programs. Not a wild animal, not a bear. But then again, not all wild animals are the same. Caroline thought of a real-life case she'd read years ago. In Alaska, a young humpback whale once became entangled in crab trap lines. After being freed by divers, it swam in slow circles around the boat, gently nudging the rescuers one by one. Scientists called it gratitude. Skeptics called it projection. But those who were there, they said they felt it. And now, here she was, kneeling in the dirt beside a broken man, while the bear he'd raised stood watch above. The forest had turned completely silent. Elias worked fast. He wrapped the leg, secured an inflatable splint, and gave Jasper a measured dose of painkiller. Then he stood and looked at Caroline. "Evac's still 30 minutes out. He won't last if the cold drops further." Caroline looked back up. "We'll have to move him, carefully." Together they built a sled from broken branches and Jasper's tent poles. Elias supported the injured leg, while Caroline packed blankets tightly. Inch by inch they pulled him out from beneath the pine, the motion pulling a strained groan from his chest, but he didn't lose consciousness. And the whole time, Coda waited. When they reached the ridge again, 2 search and rescue medics arrived on foot with a stretcher in hand. The helicopter couldn't reach the ravine, but it could land in a clearing nearby. Jasper would make it out, alive, weak, but breathing. Carolyn turned to see if Coda was still there. He was gone, vanished into the trees like a shadow melting into snow. She felt the absence more than she saw it. The medics hoisted Jasper and began the careful trek to the evac point. Elias walked beside them, still whole. Caroline lingered. She looked around the clearing, the broken branches, the subtle paw prints. Then something caught her eye. By the base of a tree not far from where Coda had first appeared was a piece of cloth. Torn, frayed at the edges. From a jacket sleeve. It wasn't Jasper's. She picked it up and turned to Elias. "There's more to this." He nodded. "This spot. This isn't just where he fell. It's where Coda stayed, protected him, possibly for days." That's when Caroline understood the real cost of failure. If Coda hadn't gone on the road, if no one had stopped, if she'd dismissed the call as just another wildlife report, Jasper wouldn't have made it through the night. And Coda likely would have stayed until he couldn't anymore. It's strange how quickly an animal can shift our view of the world. One moment they're statistics, wildlife numbers, species, facts, behavior patterns. Next, there's something else. Witnesses, helpers, messengers, maybe even friends. There's a lesson in that. Not every connection fits the language we're used to, but that doesn't make it any less real. Back at the clearing, Caroline watched the treetops sway gently in the late afternoon wind. Then she turned and followed the trail out to the same one Coda had used to bring them in. They'd found Jasper, but they still hadn't found the end of Coda's story. By the time the helicopter lifted Jasper Lane out of the forest, the temperature had dropped nearly 10 degrees. Dusk had started to settle over the Beartooth foothills, softening the trees in a haze of gold and smoke gray. Caroline stood back from the landing zone, arms crossed against the chill, her eyes scanning the tree line one last time. Still no sign of the cub. He had vanished as quietly as he came. No sounds, no trail, just a silence that settled like a question neither she nor Elias could answer. The next morning, Elias called early. His voice was calm, but edged with something unfamiliar. "You need to come to the ranger station." She drove through the morning mist, still wearing yesterday's boots. And when she pulled up to the Forest Service outpost, she saw them, 2 rangers, a medtech, and standing awkwardly on the gravel lot, Coda. Not pacing, not fearful, just there. One of the rangers had a handheld camera. "He showed up at dawn," he explained. "Walked right into the staff lot. Didn't growl, didn't run, just sat down and stared at the front door." Caroline stepped out of her vehicle slowly. "Has anyone approached him?" "No one's dared." Coda's ears twitched when he saw her. Then he stood, took 2 steps forward and stopped again. His paw lifted ever so slightly. The limp still lingered, but his eyes, those stayed on her. Elias came outside holding a field tablet. "We pulled footage from the trail cams last night," he said. "Guess where he went after the ravine?" Caroline shook her head. "He followed the same path we took out, then veered off, took a more direct line. Covered 4 miles of rugged terrain. Alone." He handed her the tablet. The screen showed night footage. Coda moving fast, climbing a slope, then arriving at the edge of the ranger station parking lot. "He didn't just stumble back," Elias continued. "He chose this." Caroline stared at the screen. Why Elias didn't answer right away. He simply looked at the cub. "We underestimated him." It went against every instinct the animal should have had. Cubs that survive are cautious. They learn fear early from loud sounds, flashing lights, the scent of oil on asphalt. Coda had been trained deliberately to avoid roads and buildings. His rehabilitation was built around reinforcing those fears, but when it mattered, he broke every rule. He had come back to the road to find help. He had returned to the ranger station to finish what he started. The last part of the rescue wasn't over, not for him. Caroline stepped closer. Coda didn't move. He blinked slowly, then lowered his head slightly. Not in submission, just calm. "I've seen loyalty in dogs," she said, "but never like this. Not from a grizzly cub." Elias spoke softly. It's not loyalty the way we define it. It's memory, pattern, instinct layered with experience. He didn't follow orders. He followed something deeper. And then quietly from behind them, a voice called out, "Can I see him?" Jasper Lane. Wrapped in fleece, his arm in a sling, his leg in a brace, he stood leaning on a ranger for support. But his face, though pale, was lit with something fierce, not pain, something close to joy. Coda turned. The moment was simple. No charge, no sprint, no dramatic music. Just one soft sound from the cub, a kind of low chirp, barely audible. Jasper smiled. That's how he used to greet me. When he was hungry. Elias motioned gently. Approach slowly. Jasper moved forward with effort. Each step dragged, but he didn't care. He reached out a hand and knelt. Coda stepped in, no hesitation, and pressed his head softly into Jasper's open palm. Caroline felt something inside her shift. It was real, not imagined, not projected, real. She thought back to a study she'd once heard Elias mention, a field experiment in Canada where a black bear returned to a wildlife station 3 times over 6 weeks. It had been partially rehabilitated, then released into a nearby forest. Each return was dismissed as territory confusion until the 4th time when it dragged in an injured sibling. That moment had changed how some researchers viewed bear cognition. They remember more than we think Elias had said back then. And Coda was proof. When the photos hit the newswire later that day, the reaction was instant. Articles flooded in, Grizzly cub saves. Human caretaker wild instinct, or something more. Coda's image, a cinnamon-coated cub pressed gently against Jasper's hand, was shared thousands of times. Letters started pouring in. A woman in Oregon wrote, "My son died last year. He loved bears." This story, it brought me peace. A retired vet from Colorado said, "I've worked with trauma cases for 30 years. That cub did what half my patients struggle with. He stayed. He helped." Even school children wrote in. One class sent drawings, crayon sketches of Coda as a superhero with a cape. But none of it surprised Caroline as much as what came next. The governor's office called, not for a political photo op, but with an honest question. What happens to Coda? Now, and that was complicated. Elias gathered the Wildlife Rehabilitation Board that same week. Legally, Coda was considered non-releasable now. He had made contact multiple times, returned to human locations, demonstrated learned behaviors incompatible with survival in the wild. "He's too attached," one board member said. "No," Elias corrected gently. "He's too aware." That distinction mattered, because it meant Coda had not failed at being wild. He had evolved into something else. A messenger, a bridge, an ambassador. Real-life sanctuaries have faced this dilemma before. Animals who couldn't go back either because of injury imprinting, or cases like Coda's, where the emotional intelligence was too developed to dismiss. The Missoula Wildlife Interpretation Center reached out next. They offered to build a custom enclosure, large natural set away from foot traffic, but accessible for education and observation. A place where Coda could live safely. A place where people could meet him, learn about grizzly behavior, and see what happened when instinct met empathy. It was controversial. Some said, "Let him go. He belongs in the wild." Others said he already gave up his place in the wild for a human. Caroline listened to every voice, but she thought of the look in his eyes, not confusion, not dependence. Choice. He chose to stay, to lead, to return. Sometimes the most powerful instinct is the one that tells you to break the rules, and sometimes a creature who was born in the forest becomes something more because of who they chose to protect. In the weeks that followed Coda's rescue, the story only grew. News outlets replayed the footage of Jasper Lane reuniting with the bear cub he'd raised. Photos of the moment Jasper's hand resting gently on Coda's head spread faster than wildfire, showing up in newspapers, wildlife blogs, even late-night television. But what no one saw, what couldn't be captured in headlines, was how that bond was formed. And what does it cost? Caroline visited Jasper at the rehabilitation center outside Bozeman not long after the media wave settled. He was recovering well. His leg, still in a brace, was healing. The bruises on his ribs had faded, but something lingered in his eyes, something quieter than pain. She brought a thermos of black coffee, and when he asked if she had time to sit, she nodded. They walked slowly through the edge of the center grounds, Jasper leaning on a cane. Beyond the fencing enclosures, stretched out toward the tree line, wooded spaces meant to simulate wild conditions without removing safety. Coda wasn't in public view yet. His area had been temporarily closed off while they constructed his new habitat, one that allowed him distance from both people and noise. "You want to know how it all started?" Jasper said softly. Caroline didn't answer. She didn't need to. He smiled, tired but warm. "Then you'll need to go back 2 years, right after the Grey Cliff wildfire." That fire had swept through hundreds of acres north of Yellowstone. Fast-moving, brutal. It left a blackened path across old hunting trails and bear habitat alike. Jasper had volunteered on the response team documenting the recovery of wildlife for a conservation series. That's where he found her, Coda's mother. "She was already dead when I found her," he said. Smoke inhalation, collapsed under a burned log. But Coda, he paused. He was hiding under her chest. Quiet, alive. Caroline felt something tighten in her throat. "They told me to leave him," Jasper continued, "but I couldn't. He hadn't even opened his eyes fully. I radioed Wildlife Services. They approved a temporary transfer to the center. That's how he came to me. He didn't say it with pride. He said it with the reverence of someone who had carried a fragile secret. He never made noise," Jasper said. "Not even when he was hungry. Just looked at me like he didn't expect anything, like he already knew how harsh the world was." Caroline asked what the first few months were like. "I didn't treat him like a pet," Jasper said quickly. "Didn't name him right away. No touch unless necessary. I wore scent blockers, used long tools to feed, and stayed quiet. We wanted him to survive, not to love us, but sometimes silence becomes its kind of connection." "He learned my footsteps," Jasper said. "He'd press his nose against the fencing when I walked past, but not for food, just presence." The name Coda came 6 months in during a snowstorm. Jasper had left behind a trail marker, a small blue cloth tied to a tree to guide staff through a blizzard to the feeding zone. When he returned, the cub was waiting beside it. He'd followed the trail marker, on his own, not for food, just to be near where he knew someone might be. That night, Jasper scribbled in his field journal, "He isn't just surviving, he's choosing." It reminded Caroline of a case she once read in a wildlife report, a polar bear in Manitoba that returned to the same trapper's cabin each spring. Not for food. Just to circle once, sniff the wood and move on. No aggression, no dependence, just memory. Bears, it turned out, remembered more than people gave them credit for. "I started training Coda for eventual release," Jasper said. "We used scent trails, road deterrents, and timed feedings. I taught him to fear humans, except in one case." Caroline tilted her head. "I made sure he knew that roads could lead to help. That noise didn't always mean danger, that if he ever felt pain or fear he couldn't fix, roads might lead him back to safety. That's why he went to the highway," she said. Jasper nodded. It was a gamble. I hoped he'd remember the markers, that he'd associate humans with safety, but I didn't know if it would work. I never got to test it. He gestured to his leg. "When that tree pinned me, I couldn't reach my beacon. I had 2 emergency locators, one on my vest, one in my pack. I strapped the working one to his leg, told him to go." Caroline stared at him. "You sent a bear cub to bring help?" Jasper shrugged. "I had no choice. And I trusted him." She thought back to the moment she'd first seen Coda on the road airs, back pacing, not running away. She remembered how he refused to leave, how he looked at her again and again. He hadn't been lost, he had been looking. The lesson was simple but not easy. Sometimes we try so hard to erase human presence from wild creatures, thinking it protects them. But what if, just what if, selective memory was part of survival? Not every animal raised by humans loses its wildness. Some simply learn how to carry both. Jasper's story wasn't about taming a bear. It was about trusting a bond built not with words or touch, but silence patterns and consistency. And when life hung in the balance, it was that quiet understanding that brought him back. "I don't want to be famous," Jasper said softly. "I just want people to see what's possible. That sometimes a bear can save a man, and sometimes a man can let go of fear long enough to believe that." A week later, Coda moved into his new enclosure. Large, quiet, full of climbing logs and shaded space. Visitors wouldn't touch him, wouldn't speak to him, but they'd see him. They'd read his story on the sign outside. And maybe, just maybe, they'd understand a little more about the animals we too often misunderstand. As Caroline stood outside the viewing area one late afternoon, a child beside her whispered, "He looks so calm." She nodded. "He knows where he is." The child turned. "Do you think he remembers?" Caroline smiled. "Absolutely." From a distance, the new enclosure looked like a slice of untouched forest, tall pines, a shallow stream, scattered logs and stone. It was carefully designed not to entertain visitors, but to let a bear be a bear. And Coda seemed to understand it was his, but he was never just any bear. It had been 4 weeks since his return to the ranger station, and the debate around his future was only growing louder. Online forums buzzed with arguments. Some wildlife advocates demanded his release. Others pushed for lifelong sanctuary. Conservation groups drafted statements. TV anchors called him Montana's miracle cub. A petition to keep Coda free had gathered 42,000 signatures in 10 days. Yet very few of those voices had ever seen him up close. Carolyn had. She visited often quietly sometimes, just standing near the observation window. Coda didn't always appear. Some days he stayed deeper in the trees, but on the days he did come close, he never paced or begged for attention. He watched, calm, still, entirely present. That's what made this so complicated. Legally, he was considered non-releasable. His repeated contact with humans broke the core criteria for Grizzly release. Rehabilitation centers across North America had strict rules for a reason. Reintroduced bears who couldn't shed human associations often ended up returning to campsites, garbage bins, or worse, roads. And many didn't survive. Caroline had read the statistics. One 2017 case in Alberta involved a black bear named Ember, raised in partial captivity. Released after 18 months of rehab, she was struck by a vehicle within a week. Another cub in Idaho, rewilded after months of successful foraging tests, was euthanized after wandering into a residential backyard twice in 10 days. The margin for error was razor thin. Elias put it plainly in one meeting, Coda might survive out there, but if he approaches just one human out of memory, he's done. And yet some still argued he deserves the wild. Let nature decide. It was a question that struck deep, not just for biologists, but for people like Caroline. People who had stood in front of this animal, who had seen him look into human eyes, not with fear, but trust. That trust had saved Jasper's life. But now, it might cost Coda his own. Inside the center, Elias had begun documenting Coda's behavior for research hours of footage, charts, observations. He tracked how the cub responded to new scents, unfamiliar noises, and shifting weather. He showed no signs of stress. He wasn't dependent. He was adaptable. "He's wild," Elias said one evening, but selectively. "That's new." "New how?" Caroline asked. "Most animals are either habituated or avoidant. Coda interacts only when there's a clear reason. It's not about tameness, it's cognition. The idea was gaining ground. An email arrived from a Colorado-based wildlife institute proposing a new classification, ambassador-grade behavior. Not tame, not releasable, but capable of aiding research and education without distress. A bridge between species understanding. CODA could be the pilot case. Still, the risk of misinterpretation lingered. Elias feared CODA becoming a mascot. Caroline feared him becoming forgotten. And then came the letter. It was from a woman in Vermont, handwritten on soft cream paper. My granddaughter watched your video about CODA. She's 6. She asked me if bears could have hearts like people. I told her yes. Thank you for showing the world that even wild things can choose kindness. Attached was a child's crayon drawing, a bear, a man, and a tree under a bright yellow sun. No names, just a feeling. Jasper read the letter aloud at the next staff meeting. His voice trembled slightly at the end. That's the choice we're making, he said. Not just for him. For every child who sees this story and believes something wild can be good. The final decision came quietly without ceremony. CODA would stay. Not in a cage, not in exile, but as the first official wildlife ambassador in Montana's updated conservation program, his care funded by public donation, his life documented not as a spectacle, but as an evolving insight into grizzly bear cognition. It was a middle path, not freedom in the purest sense, but not captivity either. Caroline sat with it for a long time. One afternoon, she stood near CODA's enclosure as a group of young students filed in, led by a guide. They were quiet, respectful, not because they'd been told to be, but because of something in the air. A stillness, a presence. CODA stepped out from behind a fallen log. Just for a moment, no roar, no performance, just a pause. The kids held their breath. Then he disappeared again. The guide turned and said softly, "And that is a grizzly who once found his way to the road. And instead of running from us, he led someone to safety." A hand went up. A boy asked, "Is he still wild?" The guide smiled. "He's as wild as he wants to be." Caroline didn't say anything. She just stood there watching the trees sway, watching the sunlight play across the grass. That's when it hit her. Maybe we've been asking the wrong question. It's not whether animals can be wild or tame. It's whether we're willing to see that some walk the line between both and do it with more grace than we give them credit for. CODA wasn't just a survivor. He was a choice. And that might be the rarest thing of all. The day of the dedication was quiet. No parade, no cameras. Just a gathering beneath the pines at the Montana Wildlife Interpretation Center, a space carved into the forest's edge where animals too wild to be pets and too imprinted to be released found their second chance. And now, at the heart of it, stood a bronze plaque bearing a single name, CODA. Caroline walked slowly along the new path, worn boots crunching softly over packed earth. Families moved gently around her, some with children holding small field notebooks, others whispering as if they'd entered a cathedral. And in a way they had. The center's new grizzly enclosure, modeled after the terrain near the Beartooth Pass, had been completed weeks ago. Logs, boulders, and even a simulated road cut through one side, placed not for theatrics, but for study. This wasn't a zoo. It was a place of observation, of respect. CODA didn't perform. He didn't need to. He appeared when he wanted, disappeared when he didn't. And on this day, as guests circled the outer path, he stood at the top of a small hill within the enclosure, watching them with the same calm, deliberate presence that had first made Caroline pause on that dusty mountain road. Jasper sat under a shade tent nearby, his crutches resting at his feet. His injuries had healed mostly, but something deeper had shifted in him. He spoke less in public interviews now, more in classrooms, in quiet conversations, in the sanctuary of his journal. Today he was here not as the man CODA had saved, but as the man who had been changed. Caroline joined him, pulling up a folding chair. "He's different," she said, nodding toward the bear. Jasper smiled. "So am I." They sat for a while, watching. On the far end of the viewing area, a ranger guided a small group of middle schoolers through the timeline of Coda's story. The words weren't dramatic, just honest, a grizzly cub orphaned in a fire, raised with boundaries, released with hope, returned with purpose. The students leaned in as the ranger shared how Coda had led rescuers to Jasper, how he had crossed roadways, braved human noise, and broken every survival instinct to save the one human who never gave up on him. One girl raised her hand. "Is he like a pet?" "No," the ranger said gently. "He's something else. He's a teacher." It was the simplest answer, and the truest. Since Coda's return, researchers had begun to document his behavior more formally. His ability to remember human paths, his navigation of roads, even how he interacted with symbols and markers, these weren't just flukes, they were data. Patterns, evidence that grizzly bears, long considered solitary and emotionally detached, were capable of far more complex behaviors than previously understood. Elias, now semi-retired, had submitted a proposal for a multi-year study based on Coda's responses to environmental cues. The goal wasn't to make bears more human, but to understand the full spectrum of how wild animals engage with their environments, and on rare occasions with us. "It's changed the conversation," Elias had said in an earlier meeting. About wildlife rescue, about what it means to rehabilitate, about how we define intelligence and emotion, and still, Coda simply was, not dramatic, not needy, just present. Caroline recalled a message she'd received weeks earlier, an email from a retired teacher in Wisconsin who had watched a documentary clip on Coda late one evening. "I didn't think I could feel connected to the world anymore," the woman had written. "But watching that bear wait for someone to follow him, it reminded me that some things, kindness, memory, trust, they don't need to be taught. They just are." There were others like her, veterans, parents, caregivers, people who had lived through hard seasons and somehow found healing through a wild animal they'd never met. They shared letters, stories sometimes, just a single line, "He helped me believe again." It was never about making Coda a hero. It was about recognizing that his story touched something quiet inside people, the part that still wanted to believe the natural world wasn't indifferent. That somewhere between instinct and reason, between forest and road, a little grizzly bear cub had made a choice. And that choice had made all the difference. Jasper stood slowly. Caroline helped him steady. He approached the observation glass and leaned gently forward. Coda looked at him for a moment, just long enough. Then he turned and padded back toward the trees. It wasn't goodbye, just a pause. A quiet acknowledgement that the story had changed, but the connection hadn't. Caroline watched the children press their hands to the glass. None of them shouted. One tried to call his name. They simply looked, eyes wide, hearts open. Maybe that was the lesson. Not that we should tame the wild, but we should listen to it. That in a world often too loud, too fast, too fractured, sometimes the most powerful messages come from what can't be explained. A cub waiting by the roadside. A trail followed not by scent but by memory. A rescue led not by command but by choice. And maybe if we're willing to slow down and pay attention, we'll realize we're part of that story too. So take a moment. Ask yourself, what part of you is still wild? Still open, still capable of trusting something without needing to understand it fully? If Coda's story reminded you of something you'd forgotten, if it brought you peace or hope, or just a quiet breath in a noisy world, then, like this video, subscribe for more stories that reconnect us to nature, to each other, and to the parts of ourselves we sometimes leave behind. Because sometimes it's the quietest voices in the forest that change us the most.